I never thought I'd be the guy writing this. Jessica, my wife of 8 years, and I always seemed like one of those couples who had it together. Sure, we had our ups and downs, but we always found our way back to each other, until recently. Now, I'm questioning everything. It started subtly, so much so that I almost missed it. Jessica began staying late at work more often. She'd always been ambitious, so at first I didn't think much of it. But then came the little changes. She was more guarded with her phone, her texts felt private in a way they hadn't been before, and she was smiling at her screen more than she was at me. When I asked, she'd laugh and say, "It's just work stuff. You're overthinking." Her dismissiveness stung, but I brushed it off. After all, trust was the foundation of our relationship, or so I thought. Things escalated when she started going out with friends more often. She'd dress up, heels, makeup, even perfume, and tell me she needed to blow off steam after stressful weeks at work. I wanted to believe her, but every time she came home, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't mine, the doubt crept in a little more. The turning point came one Tuesday. Jessica said she had another late night at the office. I decided to surprise her by bringing dinner, a small, thoughtful gesture I thought might help us reconnect. When I arrived, the building was dark, the parking lot empty. Not a single car, not a single light. I tried calling her, and it took her a few rings to pick up. "Hey, babe," she said, her voice too cheerful. "What's up?" "I brought you dinner," I replied, my stomach already in knots. "But it looks like the office is closed." She hesitated, just long enough to confirm my worst fears. "Oh, I'm at an off-site meeting," she stammered. "You didn't have to do that. I'll grab something on the way home." There was music in the background, soft jazz, the kind you'd hear at a restaurant or maybe someone's apartment, not in a business meeting. My chest tightened. I wanted to ask her about it, to demand an explanation, but I didn't. Instead, I hung up and drove home in silence, my mind racing with possibilities I didn't want to believe. That night I barely slept. Every late night, every guarded smile, every vague excuse played on a loop in my head. The Jessica I married wasn't a liar, or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. But as the days passed, my trust began to erode, piece by piece. I started watching her more closely, how quickly she'd tuck her phone away when I walked into the room, the way she'd dodge simple questions about her day. Every detail felt like a crack in the foundation of our marriage, and I couldn't ignore it anymore. Looking back, I should have confronted her then. But part of me didn't want to know the truth. I wasn't ready to face what was really happening, or how much it would hurt. The signs were piling up, each one more damning than the last. Jessica's late nights at work, the constant texts she'd hide when I walked into the room, the way she seemed to exist in another world whenever her phone buzzed, it all painted a picture I didn't want to see. But the moment that shattered my denial came one evening while she was asleep on the couch. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, lighting up the room for just a second. I glanced over and froze. The message was from someone saved as Z Redheart. My stomach tightened, and my hands felt clammy as I reached for her phone. I told myself I was only looking to prove it was nothing, that I was being paranoid. But when I opened the thread, my worst fears became reality. The texts weren't explicit, but they were undeniably intimate. Inside jokes, casual flirting, and plans for secret meetups filled the screen. One message read, "Can't stop thinking about last night. Same time tomorrow?" Jessica's reply, "You're bad, but yes." My chest ached as I scrolled further back, finding a playful selfie she'd sent him, wearing the red dress I'd bought her for our anniversary. My heart broke. I set the phone back down carefully, not wanting to wake her, and sat there in the dark, unable to process what I'd just seen. I didn't confront her then. I wasn't ready. I needed more. The next day at work, I couldn't focus. The texts played on a loop in my mind, every word cutting deeper. I thought about who Z might be, and a name surfaced almost immediately, Zach, her coworker from marketing. I'd met him once at a company party, a tall, confident guy with a grin that screamed trouble. At the time, I didn't think much of him. Now, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was the man behind the texts. That evening, Jessica claimed she was meeting her friends for drinks. I decided to follow her. My hands trembled as I trailed her car across town, keeping my distance. My heart pounded as she turned into a small cafe, not the bar she'd mentioned. I parked nearby and watched as she stepped out, dressed in heels and a fitted skirt, her hair styled in a way I hadn't seen in months. Moments later, Zach arrived. He greeted her with a smile, pulling out her chair and placing his hand on her back like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Through the cafe window, I saw them laughing, leaning in close, their heads nearly touching. The connection between them was undeniable. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel, every muscle in my body screaming to burst inside and confront them. But I forced myself to stay calm. I needed more than anger, I needed proof. I pulled out my phone and snapped a few photos. My hands were shaking so badly the first ones were blurry, but eventually, I got clear shots of them together. Jessica, laughing at something Zach had said, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Zach, smiling like a man who thought he'd won the lottery. The betrayal stung worse than anything I'd ever felt. When Jessica came home that night, she acted like everything was normal. She kissed me on the cheek, smelling faintly of wine and cologne, and told me how much fun she'd had with her friends. Her lies felt like knives, but I kept my face neutral, pretending nothing was wrong. I needed time to process, to plan my next move. As she tiptoed around the bedroom, texting someone quietly, probably Zach, I lay in bed, pretending to be asleep. My mind was racing, a storm of emotions threatening to consume me. I knew I couldn't let this go on any longer. I had to confront her. The only question was, how? The days that followed were some of the longest of my life. I went through the motions at work, but my mind was stuck on a loop, replaying what I'd seen at the cafe, what I'd read in the messages. I kept asking myself the same question, how could she do this? But no matter how much I turned it over in my mind, I couldn't make sense of it. One night, after the kids were asleep, Jessica was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone like nothing was wrong. Watching her act so normal made my blood boil. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my laptop, opened the folder of photos and screenshots I'd saved, and walked into the living room. "Jessica," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. She looked up, startled, her phone slipping slightly in her hand. "What's up?" she asked, her tone light, but I could see a flicker of unease in her eyes. She must have sensed the shift in me. I sat down across from her and turned the laptop screen toward her. The first photo was of her and Zach at the cafe, leaning in close. Her face went pale. She opened her mouth to say something, but no words came out. "I know," I said flatly, scrolling to the next photo. "I've been watching. I've seen the texts, the photos, the late-night meetings. So don't bother lying." She stared at the screen, her hands shaking. "Tyler, I can explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, my voice rising. "That you've been sneaking around with Zach? That you've been lying to my face for months? Go ahead, Jessica. Explain." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she reached for my hand, but I pulled away. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said, her voice trembling. "It wasn't planned. I felt so alone, Tyler. You've been so distant lately, so wrapped up in work and… I don't know, I just…" Her excuses felt like gasoline on a fire. "So this is my fault now?" I said, my voice cold. "You cheated on me because I was working hard to support our family?" "No," she said quickly, shaking her head. "I'm not saying it's your fault. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. But Mistake?" I cut her off. "A mistake is spilling coffee, Jessica. What you did wasn't a mistake, it was a choice. Over and over again, you chose to betray me." She broke down then, sobbing into her hands, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I sat there, watching the woman I thought I knew fall apart, and felt nothing but anger and sadness. How had it come to this? How had the life we'd built together turned into this? After a long silence, I finally spoke. Is it still happening? I asked quietly. She hesitated, then nodded, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Yes, she whispered. But I'll end it. I swear, Tyler. I'll end it. Just, please don't give up on us. I stood up, unable to sit there any longer. Pack a bag, I said, my voice shaking with anger. You're not staying here tonight. Her eyes widened, and for a moment she looked like she might argue. But then she nodded and stood, wiping her tears as she walked upstairs to pack. I sat back down on the couch, staring at the photos on my laptop, wondering how we'd gotten here and whether there was any way to come back from this. Jessica left that night without a word. I watched from the living room as she carried a small bag to her car, her face streaked with tears. The door closed softly behind her, and the sound of the engine starting felt like a final punctuation mark on the life we built together. The house felt suffocatingly quiet after she left. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet you hope for after a long day. It was heavy, like the silence after a storm has torn everything apart, leaving behind nothing but wreckage. I sat on the couch for hours, staring at the blank TV screen, replaying the confrontation in my head. Her words, her tears, the way she hesitated before admitting the affair was still happening, it all churned in my mind like a storm I couldn't escape. The next morning, the kids asked where Jessica was. My throat tightened as I tried to come up with an answer that wouldn't shatter their world. Mom had to go stay with Aunt Megan for a few days, I said, forcing a smile. She'll be back soon. They accepted the explanation, but their questions left me feeling hollow. Jessica wasn't just my wife, she was their mother. No matter how angry or betrayed I felt, I couldn't ignore what her choices would mean for them. They adored her, and the thought of them finding out the truth made me sick. Over the next few days, Jessica texted me several times. Her messages were short and apologetic. I'm so sorry, Tyler. Please let me explain more when you're ready. I know I've hurt you, but I can't lose you. Please tell me we can work through this. I didn't reply. What was there to say? Every time I looked at my phone, all I could think about were the lies, the texts with Zach, the photo of her in the anniversary dress. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the realization that she'd looked me in the eye, night after night, and pretended like everything was fine. I confided in Mike, my best friend, a few days later. He came over with a six-pack and sat across from me at the kitchen table as I told him everything. The texts, the photos, the confrontation, it all spilled out in a flood of anger and sadness. Man, that's brutal, Mike said when I finished. He shook his head, his expression a mix of sympathy and outrage. I never liked Zach. Always seemed like a sleaze. Yeah, well, he's her sleaze now, I muttered, taking a long sip of my beer. Mike leaned forward, his voice serious. What are you going to do? Have you thought about divorce? The word hit me like a slap. Divorce. It seemed so final, so absolute. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me wants to pack her stuff and tell her it's over. But another part of me. I don't know, Mike. We've been together for 8 years. We have kids. How do you just walk away from all of that? Mike nodded slowly. I get it. But you've got to think about what's best for you, man. She made her choices. You don't owe her anything. That night, I found myself sitting alone in the quiet house, the kids asleep upstairs, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I knew Mike was right. I had to figure out what was best for me, for the kids, for our future. But how do you untangle 8 years of love, trust, and memories? How do you decide if it's worth trying to fix something so broken or if it's time to let it go? I didn't have an answer yet, but one thing was clear, the path ahead wasn't going to be easy. The first few days after Jessica left, I avoided everything that reminded me of her. Her favorite mug stayed untouched on the kitchen counter. The throw blanket she always used was folded neatly on the couch, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Every room felt like it carried her shadow, and I found myself retreating to the bedroom just to escape the memories. I poured everything I had into the kids. Making breakfast, helping with homework, playing games in the yard, it became my focus, the only thing keeping me grounded. They didn't seem to notice anything was wrong, and I wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. But at night, when the house was quiet, it all came rushing back. The betrayal, the lies, the way Jessica had cried but still admitted it was all still happening, it played on a loop in my head. Part of me wanted to text her, demand to know why she did it, why she hadn't just left if she was so unhappy. Another part of me didn't want to hear any more excuses. Her texts came every day, and every day I ignored them. But one evening, after the kids were asleep and I was nursing a beer on the back porch, my phone buzzed again. "Tyler, I know you're hurting, and I know I've hurt you more than I can ever make up for. But please, I'm begging you to let me explain. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this, if you'll let me." I stared at the screen, the words blurring as anger and sadness churned in my chest. Fix this. How did she think we could fix something so broken? But as much as I wanted to ignore her, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to hear her out, not for her sake, but for mine. I typed back, my fingers trembling. "Tomorrow. Noon. Come to the house." The next morning, I woke up feeling like I was preparing for a fight. I cleaned the house, not because it needed it, but because I couldn't sit still. By the time noon rolled around, I was pacing the living room, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. When Jessica arrived, she looked hesitant, standing in the doorway like she wasn't sure she was welcome. "Hi," she said softly, clutching her bag like it was a shield. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "Come in," I said, my tone flat. "Let's get this over with." She sat on the edge of the couch, her hands twisting in her lap. I stayed standing, arms crossed, keeping my distance. "Tyler," she began, her voice trembling. "I don't even know where to start. I've made so many mistakes, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but—" "You don't." I cut her off. "So don't ask for it. Just tell me the truth." She flinched but nodded. "Okay. The truth is, I felt alone. For years I felt like we were drifting apart, like you were more focused on work than on us. And Zach, he listened. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in a long time." Her words stung, but I forced myself to stay calm. "So you cheated because you felt lonely?" She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I know it sounds like an excuse, but it wasn't about you. It was about me, my insecurities, my selfishness. I never stopped loving you, Tyler. I swear." "Funny way of showing it," I muttered, the bitterness seeping into my voice. She wiped her eyes, looking at me with a desperation I hadn't seen before. "I'm willing to do anything to make this right. Counseling, transparency, whatever it takes. Just please don't give up on us." I stared at her for a long moment, my chest tight. Part of me wanted to yell, to tell her it was too late, that she'd already destroyed everything. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the woman I fell in love with, hesitated. "I don't know if this can be fixed," I said finally. "But I'm not ready to decide that yet." Her face crumpled, but she nodded. "I understand. I'll wait. As long as it takes." After she left, I felt just as conflicted as before. Was I a fool for even considering trying to fix things? Or was I just holding on to a thread of hope because I wasn't ready to let go? The answers weren't clear yet, but I knew one thing: whatever came next, it wasn't going to be easy. The house felt emptier after Jessica left again, but this time, there was something different. Her words echoed in my mind. "I never stopped loving you." It didn't make sense, not after what she'd done. But a small part of me, buried under the anger and sadness, wanted to believe her. That night I called Mike. He'd been the only person I'd confided in so far, and I needed someone to help me make sense of everything. "So, she says she wants to fix it," I said, pacing the living room as I spoke. "Wants counseling, transparency, all of that." Mike sighed. "Do you believe her?" "I don't know," I admitted. "She seemed sincere. But how do I trust anything she says now?" "You don't," he he said bluntly. At least, not yet. Trust isn't something you can just decide to give back. She's going to have to earn it. I just don't know if I even want to try. I muttered, running a hand through my hair. How do you fix something this broken? Mike was quiet for a moment before replying. I guess the real question is, do you want to? Forget her for a second. What do you want? It was a question I didn't have an answer to, not yet. The next day, I scheduled a therapy session for myself. I didn't tell Jessica. This wasn't about us, it was about me. I needed help untangling the mess in my head, and I wasn't ashamed to admit it. The therapist, Dr. Mills, listened quietly as I laid everything out, the betrayal, the confrontation, the years of distance that I hadn't even realized were growing between Jessica and me. You've been through a significant trauma, she said when I finished. It's okay to feel conflicted. What's important is figuring out what you need to heal, whether that's moving on or working toward reconciliation. I left the session feeling lighter, but no closer to a decision. Jessica texted me again that evening. I've found a couples counselor. I hope you'll come, but I understand if you're not ready yet. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to delete it and move on with my night. But another part of me, the part that still remembered the good times, the love we'd shared, hesitated. Finally I typed back. I'll come. The first session was raw and uncomfortable. Sitting across from Jessica in the counselor's office, I felt the weight of everything we'd been through pressing down on me. She spoke first, her voice trembling as she admitted to everything, the loneliness, the choices she'd made, the guilt she carried. When it was my turn, I didn't hold back. I told her how much she'd hurt me, how betrayed and blindsided I felt. I told her about the nights I'd spent replaying every moment in my head, wondering where it had all gone wrong. The counselor listened patiently, guiding us through the conversation without letting it spiral into blame. By the end of the session, I didn't feel resolved, but I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks, a sliver of hope. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized that I wasn't ready to give up, not yet. The path ahead was uncertain, and I still didn't know if we could fix what was broken. But for now, I was willing to try. The first few counseling sessions were rough. Sitting across from Jessica, I could see the guilt in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped under the weight of what she'd done. She apologized again and again, but the words didn't make the pain any easier to bear. At the counselor's urging, we started digging into the cracks that had formed in our marriage long before the affair. Jessica admitted that she'd felt lonely for years, that she'd convinced herself I didn't see her anymore. Hearing that hurt, but what hurt more was realizing there was some truth to it. I'd been so focused on providing for our family, working late nights, taking extra projects, that I hadn't noticed how distant we'd become. But no matter how much we explored the why, I couldn't shake the question that haunted me the most. Why didn't you just tell me? I was afraid, Jessica said during one session, her voice trembling. Afraid you wouldn't care. Afraid it wouldn't make a difference. Her words cut deep. I wanted to argue, to tell her that I would have cared, that I would have done anything to save us. But another part of me wondered, would I have noticed? Would I have really listened? Outside of counseling, Jessica started making changes. She shared her schedule with me, gave me full access to her phone, and cut all contact with Zach. You can check any time, she said, handing me her unlocked phone one evening. I have nothing to hide. Her transparency felt strange at first, almost invasive, but it was a step in the right direction. Still, it wasn't enough to erase the doubts that lingered in the back of my mind. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, no matter how many gestures she made. One afternoon, while cleaning out the garage, I came across a box of old photos. Flipping through them, I found snapshots from our early years together, vacations, holidays, lazy Sundays at home. In every picture we looked happy, carefree, like the world was ours for the taking. Seeing those photos stirred something inside me, a reminder of what we'd once shared. I brought the box to our next counseling session. This is what I miss, I said, showing Jessica a photo of us laughing on a beach. This is who we used to be. I don't know if we can ever get back to that. Jessica's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the photo. I want that too, she said softly. I don't know if we can either, but I'm willing to try. Trying wasn't easy. There were nights when the anger would resurface, sharp and unexpected, and I'd lash out at her, reminding her of the betrayal. Do you even know how much you've hurt me? I asked once, my voice shaking. Yes, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. And I hate myself for it. Her vulnerability disarmed me, but it didn't erase the pain. Still, I found myself wanting to believe her. Not for her sake, but for mine. I didn't want to live in a world where love was something you gave up on without a fight. We took small steps toward reconnecting. Walks around the neighborhood. Coffee in the mornings before the kids woke up. Little moments that felt like glimpses of the life we'd once had. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was something. I still didn't know if we could fix what was broken. But for the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, it was worth trying. Rebuilding trust felt like walking a tightrope, every step shaky and uncertain. Some days, the progress we'd made in counseling gave me hope. Other days, the doubts crept back in, whispers in my mind asking if this was all a mistake. Jessica was doing everything right: transparency, consistency, showing up to every session with the counselor, but the cracks in my heart still felt too deep to mend. One evening, Jessica suggested we take the kids to the park. It was something we used to do every weekend before everything fell apart. At first, I hesitated. It felt too normal, like playing pretend in a life that didn't exist anymore. But the kids had been asking for family time, and I couldn't say no to them. The park was full of families, and for a moment, I felt like an outsider looking in. Jessica was helping our youngest climb the slide while I stood with our oldest, watching them from a distance. She looked happy. Relaxed? It was a version of her I hadn't seen in a long time, and for a brief moment, I let myself imagine that this was real, that we could find our way back to this. That night, after the kids were asleep, Jessica and I sat on the couch, the silence between us heavy but not uncomfortable. I know it's going to take a long time for you to trust me again, she said quietly, breaking the stillness. But I want you to know that I'm not giving up. No matter how hard it gets, I'll keep trying. Her words hung in the air, and I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to tell her it wasn't enough, that the hurt ran too deep. But another part of me, the part that still loved her, no matter how much I tried to bury it, wanted to believe her. The next counseling session brought a breakthrough I hadn't expected. The counselor asked us to talk about our biggest fears, the things that kept us up at night. I'm afraid I'll never be able to fix what I've broken, Jessica admitted, her voice trembling. That no matter what I do, it won't be enough to make you love me again. Her words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't thought about what this was like for her, how much guilt she carried, how scared she must be of losing the life we built. When it was my turn, I hesitated before speaking. I'm afraid of trusting you again, I said finally. Of letting my guard down and getting hurt all over again. I don't know if I can go through that. Jessica nodded, her eyes filling with tears. I understand, she said softly. But I promise, Tyler, I'll never hurt you like that again. I'll spend the rest of my life proving it, if that's what it takes. That night, I found myself replaying the session in my mind. For the first time, I saw Jessica not just as the woman who betrayed me, but as someone who was hurting too. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made me wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was a path forward. I wasn't ready to forgive her, not yet. But for the first time, I felt like I could see a future where forgiveness might be possible. It wasn't a certainty, but it was a start. After the counseling breakthrough, I found myself in a strange place, hopeful but hesitant, like standing on the edge of a cliff and trying to decide whether to jump or walk away. Jessica's words had stayed with me, her fear of not being enough, her promise to spend her life proving herself. I wanted to believe her, but trust doesn't rebuild itself with promises alone. One night, while sitting alone in the quiet of the house, I decided to pull out our wedding album. I hadn't looked at it in years. The photos told a story of joy, love, and possibility, a story I barely recognized anymore. I flipped through the pages, lingering on one of us dancing, her head resting on my shoulder, both of us smiling like the future was ours for the taking. I closed the album with a sigh. That version of us felt so far away, but a part of me longed to find it again. At our next counseling session, the counselor brought up forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting what happened or excusing it, she said. It's about deciding whether you can let go of the pain enough to move forward. Tyler, do you think you could ever forgive Jessica? The question hung in the air. Jessica looked at me, her eyes filled with nervous hope. I didn't answer right away. Finally I said, I don't know yet. But I'm willing to try. That's all I can promise right now. Jessica nodded, blinking back tears. That's all I can ask for. Later that week, Jessica asked if we could talk. The kids were at a friend's house, and the house was quiet except for the hum of the dishwasher. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared so many meals, so many conversations about our hopes and plans. Now, it felt like foreign ground. I've been thinking a lot about what you said in therapy, she began, her voice steady. About how scared you are to trust me again. And I want to do something to make you feel safer. She slid a small stack of papers across the table. It's a post-nuptial agreement. I've already signed it. I frowned, flipping through the pages. It detailed financial protections for me if she cheated again, ensuring that I'd come out of a divorce with everything intact. It was stark and clinical, but also unexpected. This doesn't fix what happened, I said after a moment. You know that, right? She nodded. I know. But I want you to know I'm serious about rebuilding your trust. This is just one way to show you that. I didn't know how to feel about it. Part of me was touched by the gesture, but another part of me hated that it had come to this. Trust wasn't supposed to need contracts or clauses. Still, I saw the sincerity in her eyes, the way her hands trembled as she waited for me to say something. Okay, I said finally. Thank you. In the days that followed, I started noticing small changes in our interactions. Jessica was more present, more attentive, and more open about her thoughts and feelings. It was a far cry from the distance and secrecy that had defined the past few years. For the first time in a long time, I felt like she was trying to connect with me, not out of guilt, but because she genuinely wanted to. One evening, after the kids were in bed, she asked if I wanted to watch a movie. It was something we used to do all the time, but I couldn't remember the last time we'd sat on the couch together just to relax. I hesitated before agreeing, unsure of how it would feel. But as the movie played, and we sat side by side in the dim light, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months: comfort. It wasn't a resolution, and it wasn't forgiveness. But it was a step, a small, tentative step toward whatever came next. Rebuilding a relationship after betrayal is like learning to walk again after a fall. Every step feels uncertain, and you're constantly bracing for another stumble. That's how it felt with Jessica. Some days I could see glimpses of the person I'd married, the one who laughed at my jokes, who cared about the little things. Other days the weight of her betrayal was too much, and the doubt crept in like an unwelcome guest. Despite my reservations, I agreed to continue counseling. Each session peeled back another layer of the distance that had grown between us over the years. We talked about the small cracks that had formed early on, the missed date nights, the unspoken resentments, the way we'd let life overshadow the connection we once had. It wasn't easy to admit my own part in the drift, but I could see Jessica was doing the same. Do you think we can ever get back to what we had? She asked during one session, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I replied honestly. But I think we can figure out if there's something worth rebuilding. At home, things were different. Jessica was trying in ways I hadn't seen before. She made an effort to spend more time with me and the kids, planning family activities and reaching out for small moments of connection. One evening, she cooked dinner, something she rarely did, and insisted we eat together at the table, no phones, no distractions. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. That night, after the kids went to bed, she sat next to me on the couch. "I know this doesn't fix anything," she said softly, "but I want you to know I'm trying. Not just for you, but for us." I nodded, not trusting myself to say much. The truth was, I could see she was trying. But effort wasn't the same as trust, and trust was still a long way off. The real test came a few weeks later when Jessica mentioned an upcoming work event. It was a casual gathering at a colleague's house, something she would have gone to without a second thought before everything happened. Now, the idea of her being in that environment filled me with unease. "Are you okay with me going?" she asked, watching my reaction carefully. I hesitated, torn between my lingering fears and my desire to move forward. "I think it's fine," I said finally. "Just keep me in the loop." She nodded. "Of course. I'll text you if you want, or call you during the night. Whatever makes you feel comfortable." Her willingness to accommodate my boundaries surprised me. When the night of the event came, she texted me a few times, small updates about who was there, what they were talking about. Later, she called me on her way home, her voice warm and steady as she told me about the night. It wasn't much, but it was a step toward rebuilding trust. As the weeks turned into months, the new routines began to feel less forced. We took walks together, started having quiet conversations after the kids went to bed, and even laughed about little things like we used to. It wasn't perfect, far from it, but it was progress. Still, there were moments when the pain resurfaced, sharp and unrelenting. Sometimes, it was a random memory of her and Zach, or a flash of anger at how easily she'd lied to me. Other times, it was the fear that I'd never truly be able to trust her again. I talked about these feelings in therapy, both alone and with Jessica. The counselor encouraged me to be honest, even when it was hard. "Healing takes time," she said. "But it also takes effort from both of you. And so far, it seems like you're both willing to put in the work." One evening, as we sat outside watching the kids play, Jessica turned to me. "Do you think we're getting better?" she asked, her tone cautious but hopeful. I thought about it for a moment before replying. "I think we're trying. And for now, that's enough." She smiled faintly, a mixture of relief and determination on her face. For the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were moving in the right direction. Forgiveness had always seemed like a distant concept, something people talked about in stories or sermons, but never something I thought I'd have to grapple with so deeply. Every time the word came up in counseling, it felt like a boulder dropped into the pit of my stomach. How do you forgive someone for breaking your heart into pieces? How do you let go of the anger, the sadness, the betrayal? The counselor reminded me often, forgiveness isn't for them, it's for you. But that didn't make it any easier. Jessica had apologized countless times, both in therapy and at home. I could see the sincerity in her actions, the way she was trying to show me that she was committed to rebuilding what she'd broken. But forgiving her felt like opening myself up to being hurt again, and I wasn't sure I could take that risk. One night, Jessica and I were sitting on the back porch after the kids had gone to bed. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the silence between us. "I've been thinking a lot about what forgiveness means," she said quietly, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea. "I know it's not something I can ask for or expect. But I want you to know that no matter what, I'm going to keep trying to make this right." Her words hung in the air, and I didn't respond right away. Instead, I stared out at the dark yard, my thoughts racing. Finally, I said, "Do you even forgive yourself?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She looked down at her mug, her voice trembling as she replied, "I don't know. Some days I think I do. Other days I look at you, at the kids, and I feel like I'll never deserve forgiveness, not from you, not from myself." Her honesty hit me harder than I expected. For all the pain I'd been carrying, I hadn't considered how much guilt she must be carrying too. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made me see her as more than just the person who had hurt me. In therapy, the counselor encouraged us to explore what forgiveness would look like, not as a single act, but as a process. "It's not about erasing the past," she said. It's about deciding whether you want to carry the pain forward or let it go. Jessica spoke openly about her regret, her desire to rebuild trust, and her hope that one day I might see her as the person she wanted to be, not the person who had betrayed me. When it was my turn to speak, I hesitated. I want to let go of the anger, I said finally. I just don't know if I'm ready to forgive yet. It still feels too raw. That's okay, the counselor said gently. Forgiveness isn't a destination. It's a journey, and it's okay to take your time. At home, the progress we'd made started to feel more tangible. Jessica continued to show up in ways she hadn't before, planning family outings, being fully present with the kids, and making an effort to reconnect with me. We started having longer conversations, the kind we used to have before life got so complicated. One evening, as we were sitting on the couch watching a movie, she reached over and took my hand. It was a small gesture, but it caught me off guard. For the first time in months, I didn't pull away. There were still hard days, moments when the memories of her betrayal would resurface and threaten to undo all the progress we'd made. But there were also moments of hope, times when I caught myself thinking that maybe, just maybe, forgiveness wasn't as impossible as it once seemed. I wasn't there yet. But for the first time, I felt like I could see the path. A few months had passed since Jessica and I began the slow, painful work of rebuilding. Some days, it felt like we were making real progress. Other days, it felt like the weight of the past was dragging us both down. But through it all, there was a quiet determination between us, a shared understanding that, no matter what, we wouldn't give up without giving it everything we had. The pivotal moment came unexpectedly. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Jessica and I were sitting in the living room, going through some old family photos. The kids had found a dusty photo album in the garage and insisted we look at it together. As we flipped through the pages, I saw snapshots of our life before everything fell apart: vacations, birthdays, lazy weekends at home. One photo stopped me in my tracks. It was from our honeymoon, Jessica and me on a boat, laughing as the wind whipped through our hair. I remembered that moment vividly. We'd been so happy, so full of hope for the life we were building together. Do you remember that day? I asked, holding up the photo. Jessica nodded, her eyes glistening with tears. I do, she said softly. It was one of the best days of my life. There was a pause, and then she added, I want us to have moments like that again. I know we can't erase the past, but I believe we can create something new, something even stronger. Her words lingered with me long after the photo album was closed and the kids had gone to bed. That night, as I lay awake, I thought about everything we'd been through, the betrayal, the anger, the uncertainty, and everything we'd fought for since. The following week, we had a session with the counselor. She asked us to talk about what we wanted for the future, what we hoped to rebuild together. Jessica spoke first. I want us to be partners again, she said. I want to rebuild the trust one broke, to be someone Tyler can depend on. I want our kids to see that even when things are hard, love can endure. Her voice wavered as she added, I know I've hurt him deeply, and I'll never stop working to make it right. When it was my turn, I hesitated. I want to let go of the pain, I said slowly. I want to believe that we can move forward, that we can build something better than what we had before. But I also want to protect myself, to make sure I'm not setting myself up to get hurt again. The counselor nodded. It's okay to feel conflicted, she said. You're allowed to hold hope and caution at the same time. What's important is that you're both willing to work toward the same goal. A few nights later, Jessica came to me with a small box. I've been thinking about our vows, she said, her voice steady but nervous. About the promises we made to each other, and the ones I broke. I want to renew them, not for a ceremony or anything, but for us. Inside the box was a handwritten letter. She handed it to me, and I unfolded it carefully. It wasn't long, but every word was heartfelt. She'd rewritten her vows, this time with an acknowledgement of her mistakes and a promise to do better. I don't expect you to forgive me right now, she said after I finished reading. But I want you to know how much I believe in us. If you're willing to give me another chance, I'll spend the rest of my life proving I deserve it. For the first time, I felt something shift inside me. The anger wasn't gone, but it wasn't as sharp. The sadness wasn't as heavy. In its place was a fragile sense of hope, like a seed just starting to sprout. I don't know what the future holds, I said finally. But I'm willing to keep trying. Jessica's face crumpled with relief, and for the first time in months, I saw a spark of joy in her eyes. Trying doesn't mean easy. That became painfully clear as Jessica and I navigated the fragile new normal we were building. The foundation was there, a willingness to work, a shared goal of healing, but the cracks still showed. Some days we'd laugh like we used to, finding small moments of joy in the mundane. Other days, a single comment or memory could send us spiraling back into tension and doubt. The kids noticed the change, though they didn't understand its depth. You and Mom seem happier, our oldest said one evening as I tucked them into bed. Their observation hit me harder than I expected. If they could sense the difference, maybe we were making progress. One weekend, Jessica suggested a family camping trip, a chance to reconnect without the distractions of work, phones, or the lingering weight of everything we were working through. At first, I wasn't sure. Being stuck in close quarters for a whole weekend felt risky, but the kids were excited, and I couldn't say no to their enthusiasm. The trip was surprisingly peaceful. We hiked, made s'mores, and told stories around the campfire. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of ease, like the pressure that had been suffocating us had lifted, even if only temporarily. That night, after the kids had fallen asleep in the tent, Jessica and I sat by the dying fire. This feels nice, I admitted, staring into the embers. It does, she agreed. I've missed this. I've missed us. Her words weren't dramatic or overbearing, they were quiet, sincere. And for the first time, I believed her completely. Back home, the work continued. Counseling became less about the past and more about how we could move forward. We focused on communication, learning how to express our needs without letting resentment fester. Jessica continued to show her commitment in ways both big and small, planning date nights, initiating conversations about her feelings, and giving me the space I needed when I struggled. But progress wasn't linear. One evening I stumbled across an old photo of her and Zach from a company event. It wasn't inappropriate, but it triggered a wave of anger I hadn't felt in weeks. Why didn't you just tell me you were unhappy? I asked later that night, unable to keep the frustration out of my voice. Jessica didn't get defensive. She sat quietly, letting my words sink in before replying. Because I was scared. Scared that you wouldn't care, or that I'd lose you if I admitted how I felt. It wasn't fair to you, and I regret it every day. Her answer didn't erase the pain, but it reminded me of the person she was trying to be, the person who was willing to confront her own flaws to rebuild what we'd lost. Months passed, and slowly, trust began to take root. It wasn't complete, and it probably wouldn't be for a long time, but it was growing. I no longer felt the need to check her phone or question her every move. She, in turn, stopped walking on eggshells around me, and our interactions felt more natural, more honest. One evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Jessica paused and looked at me. Thank you, she said simply. For what? For giving us a chance, she said, her voice steady. I know it's not easy, and I know I don't deserve it. But I'm grateful every day that you didn't give up on me. I didn't have a perfect response. Instead, I reached out and took her hand, a gesture that felt like enough for the moment. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like we were walking it together. It wasn't the life we'd imagined on our wedding day, but it was a new beginning, one we were building brick by brick, with the understanding that love, like trust, was something you had to choose every day. A year after the day I discovered Jessica's betrayal, life looked different. The pain hadn't disappeared, it probably never would, but it no longer consumed me. It had softened, becoming part of our story instead of the defining chapter. Jessica and I continued to work at rebuilding. Counseling had shifted from weekly sessions to occasional check-ins, but the lessons stuck with us. We'd learn how to communicate, how to recognize when the other was struggling, and how to address issues before they festered. One evening, after the kids were asleep, Jessica surprised me with a small box. "I know it's not our anniversary," she said, her voice steady but nervous. "But I wanted to give you something." Inside was a simple keychain, engraved with the words, "Still choosing us." It was such a small thing, but it hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just a gift, it was a promise, a reminder of everything we'd fought for. "I'm still choosing us too," I said, my voice quiet but certain. Our family began to feel like a team again. The kids were thriving, and I found myself smiling more often than not. Jessica and I started new traditions: Friday movie nights, Saturday morning hikes, and for the first time in years, it felt like we were creating a life we both wanted to be part of. There were still hard days. There were moments when doubt or anger would creep back in, uninvited. But those moments didn't last as long, and they didn't hit as hard. Jessica never shied away from those feelings. She met them with patience and understanding, always willing to talk, to listen, to remind me that we were in this together. Looking back, I can't say I'm glad it happened. The pain, the betrayal, it's not something I'd wish on anyone. But it forced us to confront the cracks in our marriage, to acknowledge the ways we'd drifted apart, and the work it would take to come back together. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't a single act. It's a choice you make over and over, a decision to let go of the past and focus on what's ahead. It's not easy, and it's not always linear, but it's possible if both people are willing to try. Jessica and I weren't the same people we were when we first said, "I do." But in some ways, that was a good thing. We'd grown, changed, and faced our worst moments. And through it all, we'd found a way to build something new, something imperfect but strong, forged in the fire of everything we'd endured. Life doesn't give you perfect endings, but it does give you second chances. And sometimes that's enough.